Hi there, brothers and sisters. We are going to be working in the first two verses of Romans chapter 12 this weekend. Our plan is to spend about the next 2 months in Romans 12, 13, 14, and the first part of chapter 15. These are verses that have been especially meaningful to the elders as we have prayed together and sought God's direction for the church. And so we wanted to work through them as a congregation. So Romans chapter 12, verses 1 and 2. I appeal to you, therefore, brothers and sisters, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your spiritual worship. Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind, so that by testing you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect. In the early 20th century, the editorial staff of the Times newspaper in London, drawing on the great concern that people had about the way things were going in the world, asked a number of public intellectuals, what's wrong with the world, and invited them to write in editorials. And people wrote about all kinds of things: poverty and industrialization and immigration and modernization. G.K. Chesterton wrote the shortest response. It was, "Dear sirs, in response to your question, what's wrong with the world? I am. Sincerely yours." And that is the premise of the whole letter to the Romans. Paul says in chapter 3 that all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. We are all broken. We are all sinners. We are all rebels. The problems in the world are not merely out there with people who are not like us or structures that are imposed on us. And the problems are not merely a part of us. We live with genetic deficiencies on every chromosome of our soul. We are the problem. And any change in the world that's going to make any real difference is going to involve us being changed, first and foremost. Leo Tolstoy, the Russian novelist, he said along this line, everyone thinks of changing the world. No one thinks of changing themselves. And that's getting at the heart of it. But how do we change ourselves if we are the ones who are broken? Right? A master carpenter could take a bent hammer and maybe still use it effectively to build a house or a piece of furniture, but a bent hammer can't repair itself. And that's what we're talking about. We are the bent hammers. We're not the carpenters. Which is why it's really good news that Jesus said, "Behold, I am making all things new," including you, including me. And that's what this text is. This is God, the God of the gospel, Jesus Christ, summoning us to be made new, to be holistically changed, to be transformed. And the way this is going to work, Paul says, is that we are to trust God with who we are and receive from God who we are meant to be. Trust God with who we are and receive from God who we are meant to be. So for the second week in a row, you get a 2-point sermon. Trust God with who you are. This is verse 1. And the way I would summarize verse 1 in a sentence is, trust God with all of who you are, which is the logical thing to do because of the gospel. Trust God with all of who you are, which is the logical thing to do because of the gospel. Let's break that down. Trust God with all of who you are. Paul says in the middle of verse 1, present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God. Paul, writing as a Jew to a church that still had a large number of Jews, is talking about the Jewish sacrificial system here, the temple sacrifices, which were the primary visible way for Israel, for God's people, to honor and worship him. And most sacrifices in the temple had a sort of symbiotic, you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours logic to them. Everybody was supposed to benefit. So you bring in a cow from your herd and it's offered on the altar. And that means that a small piece of it is cut off and burned as an offering to create an aroma, a smell that pleases God, because we're offering him something of the best of what we have. And then the priests who have renounced the right to own land of their own in order to serve at the temple, they get to eat some from the cow. And then you and your family and your clan and your town all get to feast on the cow, which was an extraordinary thing. Ancient people did not get to eat meat on a regular basis. So it was bringing a sacrifice was an immediate experience of joy and celebration and abundance. And so you could read these verses and think, oh, I'm gonna give God a little bit of the best of what I have, and I'm supposed to immediately experience this blessing and abundance and joy. That's not what Paul's talking about. When he says, present your bodies, not some fraction of your body, but your bodies as a living sacrifice, he's alluding to a particular sacrifice in Israel called the whole burnt offering. There is no symbiosis. There's no back scratching in this. This is, you take the very best cow that you've got, a year old with all of its life, all of its productivity ahead of it, when its meat is at its most tender. And you bring it and you lay it on the altar, and the whole animal is burned and offered as a sacrifice pleasing to God. Nobody wins here. You don't win. You don't get to have a feast, and your herd is less its most valuable animal. The priests don't win. They don't get to eat off of this. Not even God wins in any real practical sense. It's not like he needs the beef to sustain him. Paul says, offer yourselves in that way. This is, think of what will be for many of us our most valuable possession, our sort of year-old without blemish cow. Think of your home. This is the difference between being led by God to rent out a bedroom to an international student, right? Which would be a wonderful thing to do. And you could see the potential symbiosis there, right? They get a place to live, and they hopefully get to experience hospitality from you. You get the sanctifying and blessing experience of having somebody else in your home, and the kind of cultural wisdom that will hopefully come from that. Maybe even the kingdom wins as you walk wisely with the student and speak grace to them and share Jesus with them. That would make some sense. It may not be something that we particularly want to do, but we can understand the logic there. That's not what Paul is proposing here. He's suggesting get up, walk outside, and burn your house to the ground. Hope that it pleases God and see what happens. God is specifically calling for sacrifices where we do not understand the point of what we are doing, where it doesn't make any sense to us. And as if that's not enough, it's to be a living sacrifice, Paul says. So it's not a momentary thing. It is an ongoing, lifelong sacrifice done every day, not a second of devotion, but a trajectory of devotion. Right? When I was younger, before becoming a dad, I liked to jump off of waterfalls. And that's great because you only have to be brave for a fraction of a second. Just tense your leg muscles and push off, and then gravity takes care of the rest. That's not the kind of courage that Paul's inviting us to here. Not inviting is not the right word, summoning us to. This is trench warfare. Go up over the top of the French, over the top of the trench. I don't know why I said French. And go step by step across no man's land. Every movement of your foot, a life risk. Every movement, an act of courage. That's the kind of sacrifice that Paul's asking of us. It sounds insane to trust God with our whole selves and have no understanding of what he might do with who we are, even though we've trusted him with him. But Paul says it's actually the logical thing to do. Trust God with who you are, which is the logical thing to do. Paul ends verse 1 by saying, which is your spiritual worship? Present your bodies as living sacrifices, holy and acceptable to God, which is your spiritual worship. And the word there that is translated in the ESV, spiritual, is not Paul's usual word for spiritual. The word is logikon, logical, rational, reasonable. This is the cold, calculating Vulcan thing to do. This is the response that Spock would have to God asking him. He would say, oh, it's only logical. Why would that be? I mean, what Paul is saying here is that presenting your body as a living sacrifice might sound like trying to buy a house and flip it right after the crash in 2007. But it's actually buying a house and flipping it 3 years early when the market was booming. What is happening? Why would Paul say this is the logical thing to do? It might be the righteous or the holy or the good thing to do, but why logical? It's the logical thing to do because of the gospel. Trust God with all of who you are, which is the logical thing to do because of the gospel. Back up to the beginning of verse 1, where Paul says, I appeal to you, therefore, brothers and sisters, by the mercies of God. I appeal to you, therefore, because of everything that I just said in chapters 1 to 11. All of that's true. Therefore, I make this appeal to you to present your bodies as a living sacrifice, to trust God with all of who you are. And I appeal to you by the mercies of God. And he uses mercies plural because he's described so many ways in which the God of the gospel, in which the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit are merciful. They mercifully pay all our debts when Jesus redeems us on the cross. They mercifully erase the record of our criminal rebellion against God's good order. But most of all, in this particular moment, Paul is focusing us on the mercy of adoption. When he says, I appeal to you, brothers and sisters, he's writing to people who are as unrelated as they could be. There are Jews and Gentiles in this church, but he calls them brothers and sisters. And the reason he calls them that is because God has made them one family, made them brothers and sisters by adopting them. This is one of the mercies of God that Paul has elucidated in Romans chapter 8. Where he says, you did not receive the spirit of slavery to fall back into fear, but you have received the spirit of adoption as sons, by whom we cry, Abba, Father. The Spirit himself testifies with our spirit that we are children of God. We were orphans of our own making, living on the streets, and yet God, in his mercy, adopted us and decided to be our Father. And because of that, because of the gospel, it is only logical to trust God with all of who we are. You need to know this. All gods, by which I don't just mean things that people might call gods, but all things that would claim to make your life worth living, demand all of who you are. It's just that the God of the gospel is upfront about it. He says right here, bald-faced, present your whole bodies as living sacrifices. Most gods are sneakier about it than that, right? The God of a good reputation doesn't come to you and say, listen, if you sell me your soul, I'll make sure they think better of you. No. The God of a good reputation comes to you and says, wouldn't it make sense to pay a little more attention to the sort of things they admire? To be a little more conscious of when they are listening? To take a little more time in front of the mirror and spend a little more money on keeping up appearances? To give your stories a little more embellishment? And it nibbles bit by bit on your body, on your life, until it's had the whole meal. All gods, whatever God you happen to serve, they demand that you trust them with all of who you are. But only the God of the gospel is trustworthy. Only the God of the gospel has proven himself trustworthy by redeeming you, by justifying you, by adopting you. He's the one who gave you your life in the first place, and he is the one who has demonstrated on the cross that the totality of his will to do you good, and has demonstrated in the resurrection of Jesus the totality of his power to do you good, to renew you in better and better life. And so the Vulcan thing to do, the logical worship, is to offer yourself to him without question, without reservation. Listen to me, to put your trust in God and not in your understanding of God's plan. To trust God, who has proven himself trustworthy with all of who you are, and not to trust your understanding of God's plan, which is at best shaky with who you are. Because God has already given himself, his whole self, everything he has to us in Jesus on the cross. When we weren't trustworthy at all, giving him everything, trusting him with all of who we are, it's the only proportionate response. For me and for us, the temple sacrifices were meant to convey this, to give a picture of this, that we gave personally and collectively, right? I bring my best sheep, and you bring your best goat, and she brings her best cow, and the whole nation comes together in festival and in daily sacrifice. But even that, because it was just a part. There were festivals, but they weren't the whole year. There were sacrifices, but they weren't the whole flock. Even that is not enough. And there are hints, even in the Old Testament, that it won't be enough. Listen to the prophet Micah, writing 700 or 800 years before Paul. With what shall I come before the Lord and bow myself before God on high? Shall I come before him with burnt offerings, with calves a year old? Will the Lord be pleased with thousands of rams, with 10,000s of rivers of oil? Shall I give my firstborn for my transgression, the fruit of my body for the sin of my soul? He has told you, O human, what is good and what does the Lord require of you, but to do justice and to love kindness and to walk humbly with our God. Broadly and briefly, doing justice refers to public social goodness. And loving kindness refers to personal, soulful goodness. And walking humbly with our God refers to trusting God more than we trust ourselves. We trust God with all of who we are, private and public, personal and social, interior and exterior. It's the logical thing to do. Because in the gospel, God, through Jesus, poured out his mercies on us. Now, okay, trust God with all of who we are. How do we go about that, right? If there's no ritual, if there's no particular partial act that we can engage in that's enough, how do we present our whole selves as living sacrifices? We do it by worshiping the true God, and then from him receiving who we are meant to be. We trust God with who we are, and then we receive from God who we are meant to be. And this happens through worship. You need to recognize that all people, whether they would call themselves religious or not, are always worshiping. All people are always worshiping. Worship, the word Paul uses here, and all the words in the Bible, they don't refer to a particular cultic or ritual act. They don't even, as we often use the word now, they don't refer to music at all. None of the worship terms in the Bible are musical in nature. They have to do with service, with lifting something up as the highest priority and serving it. And we all do that all the time. And we're shaped by our worship, especially when we don't realize what we are worshiping or even that we are worshiping, right? A child with the deep misfortune to be born in Eugene is shaped to worship duck sports before they know any better. They don't recognize that that's what's happening, and then they are doomed to a lifetime of rising and falling with U of O football results. What could be worse? Paul knows this, and he warns us, do not be conformed to the patterns of this world. Do not be conformed to the patterns of this world. The image here is of something that happens to us, that shapes us with our cooperation, but not with our awareness, right? Water being conformed to the shape of the container it's in, or think of being conned, right? You go along with a con because you really believe the person on the other end of the email is a Nigerian prince in desperate need. But you're not aware of what's happening. That's what being conformed to the patterns of this world is. It's not a conscious decision, right? So being conformed to the patterns of this world was not when I decided that the two colleges I would apply to would be UNC Chapel Hill and a little school in Minnesota called Carleton. Being conformed to the patterns of this world was that as a professor's kid in a university town, I took it for granted that the whole pattern of higher education was not just something worthwhile, but something inevitable, something mandatory for a good life, right? And in a college town, we might say, well, of course, how could it be any other way? The data is in. People who go to college have higher incomes and report higher levels of happiness. But that's the whole point. We assume the pattern and we conform ourselves to it. So being conformed is not my desire to see this person make it into office or that person not make it into office. Being conformed to the patterns of this world is my just accepting as inevitable reality a months-long period in which we as a society spend, I don't even know how many hundreds of millions of dollars or how many millions of hours concerning ourselves with who will occupy office. We take that for granted. We're conformed to that pattern, and these patterns, they shape our worship, and therefore they shape us. And they shape us with our cooperation, but without our conscious decision, without our deliberate awareness, right? It's not that I choose to pursue inner peace by getting up early and going for a run and listening to hymns, and somebody else chooses to pursue inner peace by going to yoga 4 times a week. The point is that we all assume inner peace is the goal, even though if you read the Bible, it's pretty clear that God's okay with his people not always experiencing inner peace. We become conformed to the patterns of this world. It happens upon us. And Paul warns us to be on the lookout for this, to watch our own assumptions, the things we take as given. And he says, don't do that, but instead be transformed by the renewal of your mind. So don't be unwittingly conformed, but be deliberately, wittingly transformed, right? These other schemes, these patterns of the world, they're illogical worship because they are ultimately based on giving yourself over to serving something that isn't ultimate. They are, the Greek is actually not the schemes of this world, but the schemes of this age, and they are passing away. But if we're not paying attention, if we're not renewing our minds on the true ultimate reality, on the mercies of God, we don't notice that college went from being a good thing to an indispensable thing. That having the right political party in power went from being a worthy goal to an ultimate goal. And so the very things that we think will fill us up, will make our lives worth living, actually end up poking little holes in the bottoms of our hearts and draining our life away over time. But when we continually renew our minds by dwelling on the mercies of God, this exposes how illogical our other worship is, right? The dwelling upon God's forgiveness brings to light, it exposes the foolishness of holding grudges. Dwelling upon God's provision exposes the wastefulness of financial anxiety. Dwelling upon God's abundance exposes the thinness of online life. Dwelling upon God's community exposes the selfishness of individualism. And this transforms us, Paul says. Transformed, it means shape-shifted. It means changing the contours of every part of your life, what you daydream about and what you spend money on. And it involves changing the shape of our collective life. It changes how we spend our time together in worship, or how we do justice and love kindness and walk humbly with our God together. And did you notice the strange order of operations that Paul lays out for how this is going to work in verse 2? Renew your minds, be transformed, then know God's will. Right? That's how verse 2 ends. That you may, by testing, discern God's will, what is good and acceptable and perfect. That seems backwards to me. I want to know God's will first. How exactly do you want me to live in these particular circumstances, God? Because once I know that, then I can put together a plan for transformation, right? Once we know God's will for Calvin over the next few years, we can put together a vision team that will pray and organize and give us a 5-year plan. And we can have charts and check-ins and maybe one of those little thermometers to measure our collective doing justice and loving kindness and walking humbly with our God. But even as I do this, I fail to account for how much, by the act of trying to be in control of my own transformation, I am actually in my own way. How much I still need not to be conformed to the schemes of this age, all of which say, hey, you be in charge. And so Paul says, don't begin by working out a transformation plan. Begin with the renewal of the mind, with dwelling upon the singular worthiness of God and his infinite mercies. As we do that, we will be transformed. Transformation will be worked in me by the reality of God's mercy, with my cooperation, but without my full understanding. George MacDonald told a parable to explain this, and I ran across it in Mere Christianity, C.S. Lewis's book, and he says this: imagine yourself as a living house, a temple, if you will. God comes in to rebuild that house. At first, perhaps you can understand what he is doing. He's getting the drains right and stopping the leaks in the roof and so on. You knew that those jobs needed doing, and so you're not surprised. But presently, he starts knocking the house about in a way that hurts abominably and does not seem to make sense. What on earth is he up to? The explanation is that he is building a quite different house from the one you thought of. Throwing out a new wing here, putting on an extra floor there, running up towers, making courtyards. You thought you were going to be made into a decent little cottage, but he is building a palace. He intends to come and live in it himself. We assume, having been conformed to the patterns of this world, we assume that we will be the architects of our own transformations, that we will determine the priorities and set the schedule. But that only shows the foolishness of our conformity. Like when we believe the commercials telling us to express our unique, authentic selves by driving the same Tesla and wearing the same Gore-Tex jacket and drinking the same fair trade, locally roasted coffee as everybody else. You are not the architect of your own transformation. Calvin, as a community, is not the architect of our own transformation. How could we be? Bent hammers, right? Even the most skilled surgeons in the world don't perform procedures on themselves. And at the very least, wise therapists don't go to themselves for counsel. God is the one who sets the purpose and the pace of our transformation, and we are along for the ride. And that's good news, right? He's the one who's proven himself trustworthy. We also have a track record. Unlike God's, ours is littered with untrustworthiness. But God's track record is perfectly reliable. It's totally established. We know who he is and what he is about, and we can count on him, and we want him to be the architect. And he sets to work by saying to us again and again and again, trust me with who you are. Give me your whole self. Without knowing what I will do with it, present your bodies as a living sacrifice. Only then can you be transformed. Only then can you receive from me who you are meant to be, your true self. And gradually, at a pace we cannot predict and in ways we cannot imagine, gradually, our renewed minds are transformed by the mercies of God, and we become who we were meant to be. We become able to hear what he is saying. We learn to discern and approve of and delight in his will. I want to give two examples. One is a complete story, or mostly complete story, and another is very much open-ended. On a more personal level, this happened to the Washburns leading up to us moving to Corvallis. I think we would have said we desired to present our bodies as a living sacrifice, to trust God with all of who we are, but we were sure that meant we would live in the town in North Carolina where we had been living, with the people we loved so much, with the church that was so dear to us that we wanted to keep participating in and serving in. And we were praying, God, how do you want us to do this? And for a year and a half, we got no answers until finally I was reading through the letter to the Philippians, in which the Philippians is like the one letter where Paul's not mad at the people he's writing to. He loves them. He misses them. He's saying, I want to see you as soon as I can. I count you pure joy. I'm thankful always for your partnership in the gospel. And I'm reading this letter and I'm thinking and praying, like, thank you, God, for putting us in a church like the church in Philippi. What a blessing to be here with this congregation. And God says, you wouldn't be reading this letter if Paul had not left Philippi. Now, I want you to know that God had said to me before that, multiple times, through people I trusted, Zach, it's time for you to move on. And I had been incapable of hearing it, because in my mind, the mercies of God for the Washburns were confined to Black Mountain, North Carolina. And it took a year and a half for my mind to be renewed that God's mercy might extend to us going somewhere else, serving and being a blessing and being blessed somewhere else. But once that clicked into place, it transformed us. I mean, obviously we live in Oregon and not North Carolina now. It transformed the church that we're a part of. It transformed our daily routines because we both have different jobs than we used to have. It transformed all kinds of things. And only having that happen do we have any hope of discerning what God's will for us here in Oregon is. God says to me again and again and again and again, trust me with all of who you are, including where you live, Zach. And eventually, by God's mercy, I'm able to hear it, and our lives are transformed. That's one example. It's pretty personal. I want to talk about another collective example where I don't know. Okay, it's clear, we know from Scripture that God is a God of every tribe, nation, language, and tongue, and a God of justice. That he's not just the God of the middle class, that he's not just the God of the white people, he's not just the God of Americans, but he is the God of the whole earth, and that our destiny is to dwell in his kingdom with people of every sort. Right? And that's how far we are from that is being once again made very apparent in our country and in our world this year. I know these things, and I know that by God's mercy, somehow he will lead us in anticipating his kingdom. Now, I have no idea how his mercies will transform us as a community to better do justice, to combat the inequalities, the iniquities, to use the biblical word, that exist in our society. And I'm particularly confused because we live in Corvallis. We don't live in Memphis or Pittsburgh or Minneapolis or even Portland, right? Here, we live in this place where everyone wants to be extraordinarily welcoming of those who are different. As long as they can afford the housing prices and the property taxes and probably international tuition at OSU. Right? So I have no idea how we go about actually doing justice, not just sort of hoping that people in different demographic contexts do justice. But I believe that God will, at his own pace and in his own way, transform us and make it clear, make it possible for us to discern his will. And I believe that that will happen by the renewing of our minds. And so I'd invite you, there's going to be a prayer time later in the service for our transformation as societies, to pray for that. Because it's something that it's our collective mind being renewed, if it's our collective bodies being transformed. And it's something God will lead us to together. But we want to be willing, open to cooperating with what God is doing. We trust God with all of who we are, and then we receive from God who we are meant to be. And the application, the how of this is not go transform yourselves. Do not develop a transformation plan and try to summon the willpower to execute it. If you see us as a church doing that, stop us, call us out. No. We become willing to be transformed by dwelling upon the mercies of God. And the best way to dwell upon God's mercies is to speak God's mercies, to tell one another in community about the gospel, about being saved, about being adopted, about being brought out of the kingdom of darkness and into the kingdom of the beloved Son, by reminding each other of the mercies of God the Father, who sent God the Son to present his body as a living sacrifice, which was actually holy and acceptable to God, in the place of all of our partial sacrifices, every one of which, apart from Jesus, are unclean and unacceptable. Remind one another of the mercies of God the Father, who pours out on us, God the Spirit, and reshapes us as individuals and as communities, minds and bodies, from the inside out. And trust that as we dwell together upon the mercies of God, the logic of trusting God with who we are will become more and more obvious. And we will be more and more prepared to receive from God who we are meant to be. We sang this logic earlier in the service, and I want to remind you of it now. Listen to the words of Isaac Watts. When I survey the wondrous cross on which the Prince of Glory died, my richest gain I count but loss and pour contempt on all my pride. Forbid it, Lord, that I should boast, save in the cross of Christ my God. All the vain things that charm me most, I sacrifice them to his blood. See, from his head, his hands, his feet, sorrow and love flow mingled down. Did e'er such love and sorrow meet, or thorns compose such a crown? Were the whole realm of nature mine, that were an offering far too small. Love so amazing, so divine, demands my soul, my life, my all. Father in heaven, we believe these words. Help our unbelief. Teach us to survey the wondrous cross on which your Son Jesus poured out all your mercies in his own blood. Teach us to point one another to the cross. Teach us to sacrifice all the vain things, all the false, illogical gods that charm us most, all the patterns of this world, for the sake of responding to your divine love by offering you our souls, our lives, our all. You are trustworthy, Father. Teach us to trust you with who we are. You are the giver of all good gifts. Teach us to receive from you who we are meant to be. Amen.